Imagine believing you're making your own choices, only to realize later that every option placed in front of you was carefully selected, not forced, not threatened, just guided. Elizabeth Keene wasn't controlled through violence or fear. She was controlled through context. This video isn't about blaming Liz, it's about understanding how close she came, repeatedly, to breaking free, and why she never fully did. Because manipulation doesn't succeed by overpowering people. It succeeds by making them feel autonomous. The task force assignment, control, disguised as opportunity Liz's introduction to the task force, feels like recognition, a promotion, a chance, a vote of confidence. That's what makes it dangerous. The pressure point was timing. She was recruited before she had institutional footing, allies, or internal credibility. She didn't choose the environment. The environment chose her. What prevented collapse wasn't Liz's compliance. It was her inexperience, because she didn't yet know what questions should be asked. Power rarely announces itself as control. It presents itself as opportunity. If Liz had delayed acceptance, even briefly, she might have entered the task force with leverage instead of dependency. And dependency is the easiest surface to manipulate. The brilliance of this approach lies in its invisibility, because when someone believes they've earned their position through merit, they never question the foundations upon which that position rests. Liz walked into a predetermined structure thinking she was building her career, unaware that the architecture was designed long before she arrived. Raymond Reddington's honesty, the most effective lie. Raymond Reddington never lies to Liz outright, and that's the trick. He offers truth selectively, always enough to feel respected, but never enough to feel informed. The danger wasn't deception, it was framing. Reddington controlled not the answers, but the order in which Liz received them. Because the person who controls sequence controls interpretation. If Liz had documented contradictions instead of confronting them emotionally, pattern recognition would have replaced trust, and the illusion breaks fast. This technique proves more powerful than outright fabrication because it exploits the human need to believe we're dealing with honest people. When someone tells you verifiable truths, your mind extends that credibility to everything they say, creating a halo effect that shields the carefully orchestrated omissions. Reddington understood that the most effective chains aren't forged from lies. They're constructed from truths arranged in precisely the wrong order. Emotional stakes. When curiosity becomes leverage, every time Liz got closer to the truth, the cost increased. Family, identity, safety. That wasn't accidental. The pressure point was emotional escalation, because the higher the personal cost, the harder it becomes to walk away. What kept the manipulation intact was Liz's need for coherence, the human instinct to make pain mean something. People don't seek truth when it threatens their sense of self. They seek meaning. If Liz had accepted uncertainty instead of closure, she could have paused the game, because manipulation collapses when the subject stops needing resolution. The psychological trap here operates on a principle known as sunk cost fallacy, but applied to emotional investment rather than financial expenditure. Each sacrifice Liz made became a reason to continue, rather than a warning to stop, because walking away would mean admitting that all previous suffering was meaningless. The manipulator doesn't need to justify the next sacrifice. The victim does it themselves, retrospectively validating past choices by making new ones. Institutional silence. When no one corrects the story. Notice how rarely anyone steps in to reality check Liz. Not because they can't, but because they're incentivized not to. The task force benefits from her proximity to Reddington, and challenging the narrative risks the asset. The danger point was isolation inside a group, because institutions don't manipulate directly. They allow manipulation when it's useful. If a neutral internal review had been triggered, one without emotional investment, Liz's role would have been reclassified from asset to vulnerability. This reveals how organizational dynamics can amplify individual manipulation, creating an ecosystem where harmful patterns persist not through malice, but through collective self-interest. Everyone around Liz had reasons to maintain the status quo, and those reasons had nothing to do with her well-being. The silence wasn't conspiracy, it was convergence, where multiple parties independently chose inaction because intervention threatened their own objectives. Betrayal as a tool. When shock replaces analysis. Every major betrayal in Liz's life resets her because shock narrows focus and anger simplifies complexity. Manipulation thrives in that window. The pressure point is emotional overload when reaction replaces reasoning. Betrayal isn't just damage, it's distraction. If Liz had delayed reaction even once and analyzed who benefited from the chaos, the pattern becomes undeniable. The neuroscience behind this is straightforward. Acute stress floods the prefrontal cortex, temporarily impairing executive function while amplifying emotional responses. Manipulators who understand this timing can weaponize betrayal, deploying revelations strategically to create cognitive tunnels where the victim can only see the immediate wound, never the larger pattern. Each betrayal became a reset button, wiping previous doubts and replacing them with fresh trauma that demanded immediate processing, leaving no bandwidth for strategic thinking. The illusion of choice. False dilemmas everywhere. Liz is constantly presented with binaries. Trust him or lose everything. Walk away or destroy the truth. Obey or endanger others. Those aren't choices, they're constraints. The danger was never the decision itself. It was believing there were only two options. Manipulation succeeds when alternatives are hidden, not removed. If Liz had created a third option, external documentation, independent allies, delayed action, control shifts immediately. This technique, known as false dichotomy, is perhaps the most invisible form of coercion because it masquerades as autonomy. Liz believed she was making free choices, never recognizing that the menu itself was fabricated. The real power wasn't in forcing a particular decision. It was in defining what decisions were available. Every time she chose between two bad options, she reinforced the framework that limited her, gradually normalizing constraint as though it were freedom. Identity revelation. When truth arrives too late. By the time Liz learns critical truths, she's already entangled emotionally, professionally, and legally. The pressure point wasn't the revelation, it was timing. Information delivered late doesn't empower, it pacifies. If even one truth had arrived early, before emotional investment, Liz's entire trajectory changes, because knowledge is only power when it arrives before commitment. The strategic withholding of identity-defining information creates a peculiar form of captivity. Liz discovers who she is only after becoming someone else entirely. Each delayed revelation arrived precisely when it would cause maximum dependence rather than maximum liberation, transforming what should have been empowering knowledge into another layer of obligation. The truth became a weapon precisely because it arrived after she'd already built her entire reality on its absence. The final miscalculation, mistaking awareness for freedom. At some point, Liz realizes she's been manipulated, and that feels like victory. It isn't. Awareness without leverage is just pain with clarity. The system around her doesn't change, the incentives don't change. Only her understanding does. Knowing you're trapped doesn't free you. Changing the structure does. If Liz had acted when awareness first appeared, before exhaustion set in, escape was possible. Delay turned insight into resignation. This represents perhaps the cruelest dimension of sophisticated manipulation. The moment when victims see the cage clearly, but lack the resources to open it. Awareness without agency creates a special kind of suffering, informed helplessness, where you understand exactly how you're controlled but remain unable to change it. The manipulator's victory is complete when the victim can explain their own entrapment in perfect detail, yet continues walking the same path. Protective gestures. When rescue reinforces dependency. Reddington saves Liz repeatedly from assassins, from consequences, from her own mistakes, and each rescue deepens the bond. The pressure point is manufactured vulnerability. Create the threat, provide the solution, become indispensable. What makes this effective isn't gratitude alone. It's the psychological debt that accumulates with each intervention. Protection can be a cage when the protector also controls the danger. If Liz had questioned why threats always emerged when distance appeared, she'd recognize the pattern wasn't random. It was strategic. This dynamic mirrors classic protection racket logic applied to emotional relationships. The rescuer's value increases proportionally to the danger level, creating perverse incentives to maintain or escalate threats. Each salvation becomes evidence of necessity, proof that independence equals vulnerability and survival requires submission. The pattern trains the victim to associate safety with proximity to the very person orchestrating their danger. Controlled opposition. When enemies serve the handler. Notice how Reddington's enemies conveniently validate his warnings, appearing when doubt surfaces and disappearing when loyalty returns. The pressure point is external confirmation bias, because when the world proves your manipulator right, skepticism becomes dangerous. What sustained the cycle wasn't Reddington's credibility. It was the carefully curated evidence surrounding him. The most effective manipulators don't just control you, they control your validators. If Liz had investigated the timing of threats versus her emotional state, correlation would have exposed orchestration. This technique demonstrates sophisticated environmental control, where the manipulator doesn't just manage direct interactions, but architects the entire ecosystem of validation. When external events consistently confirm the handler's narrative, the victim's reality testing mechanism becomes compromised. Independent verification becomes impossible when all verification sources are compromised or choreographed, creating a closed information loop where every data point reinforces the central manipulation. Sacrificial truth, when small admissions hide. Larger deceptions. Reddington occasionally confesses wrongdoing through minor sins, calculated vulnerabilities, and strategic guilt. Each admission builds credibility for the larger lie. The pressure point is performative honesty. Give away what doesn't matter to protect what does. Confessing small truths is how the biggest lies survive scrutiny. If Liz had measured confessions against withheld information, she'd notice asymmetry. What he admits versus what he conceals reveals priority, not character. This tactic exploits the human tendency to believe that people who confess minor transgressions must be fundamentally honest, creating a credibility reservoir that can be spent on larger deceptions. The confessions serve as inoculation against suspicion, because once someone has demonstrated apparent honesty in small matters, we extend that assessment to larger claims. The strategy transforms vulnerability into armor, using selective disclosure as a shield against deeper investigation. Isolation through specialization, when uniqueness becomes loneliness. Liz is told repeatedly she's different, with special access, unique insight, and that she's the only one who understands. That distinction isolates her from peers who might offer perspective. The pressure point is weaponized exceptionalism, because when you make someone feel chosen, they'll defend the choice even when it harms them. Isolation doesn't require physical separation. It requires psychological distance from alternative viewpoints. If Liz had actively sought perspectives from those outside the narrative, people with no investment in her relationship with Reddington, the spell breaks through simple comparison. The genius of this approach lies in making the victim complicit in their own isolation, because they voluntarily distance themselves from others who wouldn't understand their special circumstances. Exceptionalism becomes a prison where the bars are made of pride and the lock is ego, and the victim guards their own cell, because leaving would mean admitting they were never special, just manipulated. Crisis escalation, when urgency prevents reflection. Every revelation comes with a ticking clock. Someone's dying, evidence is disappearing. Action must be immediate. The pressure point is manufactured urgency, because when you strip away time, you strip away judgment. Urgency is the enemy of analysis, and manipulators thrive in crisis because crisis demands decision without deliberation. If Liz had imposed a mandatory waiting period, even hours, between revelation and response, patterns would emerge that panic obscures. This constant state of emergency creates decision-making conditions that favor the manipulator, because rushed choices bypass the analytical processes that would otherwise detect inconsistency. The perpetual crisis ensures that Liz never has enough time to connect disparate information points, to consult with others, or to simply sit with contradictions long enough for patterns to clarify. Each urgent situation demands immediate response, and in that immediacy, critical thinking dies.